Welcome back to Higher Change. We're talking about social conformity and cults. This comes from social psychology. It's one of my favorite topics, which is why I teach a whole class on the subject. The main point of this lesson is that we're all influenced by our social environment more than we realize. Therefore, rather than looking at people as if they are isolated, it's important to see people in their social context. And that's why we talk about social psychology. Let's talk about some of the points we're going to cover. We're going to cover aggression, pro-social behavior. We're also going to look at reasons or factors that cause people to conform to others. We're also going to talk about the bystander effect, compliance techniques. We're also going to look at causes for obedience, and we're going to look at common features of cults and why people join them. Let's start talking about social learning. Social learning theory has been used to explain the development of aggression. And what's aggression? Aggression is defined as any behavior intended to hurt or destroy another person and is driven by both biological and social factors. So not one or the other, but both. So that is what aggression is. It's intended to hurt. Why would people want to hurt others? That's really what the question is. So early research has suggested that aggression was a basic human instinct. However, not all people get aggressive under similar situations. Another theory is the frustration-aggression hypothesis. This was the outdated belief that aggression was simply due to people acting out of frustration and that frustration always preceded aggression. But now we know that it's a lot more complicated than that. A lot of people get frustrated and yet they don't get violent or aggressive. So it's more complicated. Biology does play a role in aggression due to the following factors: genetics. Then there's the amygdala. That's the fear center, the part of the brain that controls fear and responds to it. Then there's the testosterone and serotonin levels. So people who have high testosterone tend to be more aggressive. And there's also the influence of alcohol as well as other drugs. Those tend to make us more aggressive. According to Albert Bandura's social learning theory, aggression is a result of observation of aggressive models. Bandura conducted the Bobo doll experiment, if you recall. The Bobo doll experiment separated children, and what they did was they had, in one group, they had an older adult who came in and demonstrated aggressive behavior toward the Bobo doll. And in the other group, the teacher or the older adult acted more in a controlled fashion and didn't just demonstrate any aggression. What they found was that the children in the group or in the classroom or whatever with the adult who acted aggressively, those children also acted aggressively. Whereas with the adults who did not act aggressively, those children also did not act aggressively. So what it was found is that children seem to model after older adults, and those that are exposed to violence are more likely to repeat it. This has implications for the effects of violent media on us. So violent media includes television, movies, and video games, and can stimulate aggressive behavior both by increasing aggressive tendencies and providing models of aggressive behavior. The limitation is that these seem to apply more to children. So in other words, that's why we have ratings on movies and games. Children who are not emotionally mature yet are not able to differentiate between fantasy and reality. And so if they are watching violence, they're more likely to think that's okay and they're more likely to repeat it. Whereas older children and adults are able to separate reality from fantasy. And if they see violence, they understand this is just acting, and they know that this is not something they want to emulate. So that's why it's important for us to have these kinds of ratings so that young children are not prematurely exposed to aggression and violence in media. So going back to the other explanations, there are other explanations such as social roles. Social roles are also powerful influences on the expression of aggression. This can be seen in the Stanford prison study, which we're going to look at. But let's also talk about pro-social behavior. It's not just aggression, but we're also interested in why do people engage in good behavior or altruistic behavior. So a socially desirable behavior that benefits others is called a pro-social behavior. Altruistic behavior or altruism is pro-social behavior in which a person helps someone else without expectation of reward or recognition, often without fear for his or her safety. So we think of people who are heroes. These are people who oftentimes act because they feel compelled to do something. Otherwise, they take on that sense of responsibility that they need to do something. Otherwise, who would? So that is a sense of altruism. And sometimes they do it with the danger to themselves that they could get hurt. Unfortunately, there's other forces at play that would prevent people from engaging in pro-social behavior. Forces such as the bystander effect and the diffusion of responsibility can conspire to make help giving unlikely even in very obvious situations. Let's talk about the bystander effect then. The bystander effect refers to the effect that the presence of other people has on the decision to help or not help, with help becoming less likely as the number of bystanders increases. The more people nearby, the less likely it is that help will be offered to a person in need. That's because there is a diffusion of responsibility. The diffusion of responsibility occurs when a person fails to take responsibility for actions or for inaction because of the presence of other people who are seen to share that responsibility. So if you're in a crowd of people and you're passing by somebody who is hurting, you're less likely to do something because you think that maybe someone else can do something. There's that diffusion of responsibility. This reduces the likelihood that any one person will feel personal responsibility for helping. So it seems paradoxical. The more people there are in the crowd, the less likely anybody will respond. Latane and Darley found that people who were alone were more likely to help in an emergency than people who were with others. That's really surprising. So it really raises the question of what would you do if you were in a situation where somebody was in need? Many people think that they would be a hero, but the reality is that when there's a lot of people around, we're less likely to do something. So to overcome the bystander effect, there are 5 steps when people make a decision to help. First, they have to notice that there's an emergency. For example, if someone's drowning, it can be very quiet, and you may not know or realize that this is a life-threatening emergency. So it takes being aware and paying attention. The second thing is defining the situation as an emergency. So once you realize that there's a crisis, you have to define it, that this is something that needs action, or somebody could get hurt or die. Then the next step is to take personal responsibility. This is in contrast to the bystander effect, where everybody thinks that somebody else is going to do something. Instead, somebody feels that they need to take responsibility to actually do something. The next step, of course, is to plan a course of action. So if you see somebody hurting, you might have to think, before you get yourself killed, that you have to think about how you would go about intervening to save them without actually hurting yourself. For example, if you jump in to save somebody who's drowning and you're not trained or not prepared, you could end up drowning yourself. And then the last step is, of course, to take action. It's not sufficient to just think about it. You have to actually act on it. So all these things are really in the domain of social psychology. Social psychology is looking at people in the context of their social environment. None of us live in a vacuum. We're all influenced by the people around us. So social psychology is a scientific study of how a person's behavior, thoughts, and feelings are influenced by the real, imagined, or implied presence of others. Social psychology can be broadly divided into the areas of social influence, social cognition, and social interaction. Let's start looking at the Stanford prison experiment. This is going to help us understand certain things like social roles and social interactions. In 1971, Philip Zimbardo, a psychology professor at Stanford University, conducted the controversial Stanford prison experiment to investigate the effects of perceived power and social roles. He recruited college students and had them act as the roles of either prisoners or guards. Now, Zimbardo concluded that rather than individual personality traits, the simulated situation caused the aggressive behavior through the powerful influence of social roles, meaning that how people defined what they were supposed to do ultimately influenced their behavior. A social role is a pattern of behavior that is expected of a person who is in a particular social position. You might be in a position of authority or you might be a subordinate. But either way, that role is going to define the behavior that's expected of you. It also illustrated the powerful effect of the use of authority in making people act against their beliefs. So that brings us to the subject of social influence. Social influence is a process through which the real or implied presence of others can directly or indirectly influence the thoughts, feelings, and behavior of an individual. Social influence typically takes the form of conformity, compliance, and obedience. What are those things? Let's talk about each of those. Conformity. Let's talk about the first. Conformity is a process of changing one's own behavior to match that of other people. The Asch conformity experiments were a series of studies in the 1950s by Solomon Asch to see if participants' judgment of the length of lines were influenced by other people. Participants were asked to select which line matched the one presented. For example, in the pictures shown here, on the left is a line that they were asked to match with those on the right. Now, what they didn't know is that the room would be full of people who were actually participating in the research study to confuse things. They were called Confederates. So what they found was that subjects conformed to group opinion about 1/3 of the time, meaning that the Confederates actually tried to tell them the wrong answer, hoping that they would actually say the wrong answer. And what they found was that when other people gave the wrong answer, the research participant, the actual subjects, conformed to the group opinion 1/3 of the time, even though it went against what they believed was correct. So for example, in this picture, you might take a guess at which line matches which line. And so the one on the left matches the one on the right that has the letter C under it, right? So in this experiment, the Confederates would give the wrong answer, like A or B. And if everybody did it, then they're more likely to actually give the wrong answer, even though they knew that it didn't seem right. So what they found is that conformity increased as the number of Confederates, or the actors in the room, rose to 4. But after that, they found that the level plateaued. So it only took about 4 people to get the research participants to change their mind. And actually even less than that, but then the effect had less of an effect as well. Conformity decreased if just one Confederate gave the correct answer. So the idea is that the more peer pressure, the more likely we are to do something wrong or give the wrong answer. Members of a collectivistic culture tends to show more conformity than those from individualistic cultures. They also looked at gender differences, and what they found was that men and women don't have differences in their conformity unless it's in the public. So when men and women are asked their answers in private, then they're more likely to give a non-conformative answer. However, when they were in public, women were more conforming than men. So maybe there are some gender differences in that regard. Let's talk about compliance. We talked about conformity, and that's about how people end up changing their behavior. But compliance is the changing of one's behavior as a result of other people directing or asking for the change. So conformity is an implicit change, or change that's more unconscious, whereas compliance is a change that occurs as a direct result to somebody asking. So it would be more on the conscious level. The branch of psychology that studies the habits of consumers in the marketplace, including things like compliance, is known as consumer psychology. And that's because people want to know how to market their products and how to make advertising more effective to get people to buy their products. And so this is why they're interested in compliance. The research on compliance has looked into the techniques of persuasion that are often used at car dealerships or sales by salespeople and shops and real estate agents and other things like that. Anybody who's in the sales profession. What are some of the persuasion techniques that people use? And so they include the foot in the door technique, the door in the face technique, the principle of reciprocity, and the lowball technique. Let's talk about each of these. The foot in the door technique is asking for a small commitment and then after gaining compliance, asking for a bigger commitment. So for example, they might start with a small offer, maybe a small subscription or a small, they might start with a small model of a car. But then they want, after they get you to say yes, and they start adding features or other options that start to raise the price overall. And that's the foot in the door technique. They get you because it seems cheap in the beginning, but then over time, the price keeps going up and up. And that's the foot in the door technique. Another technique is the door in the face technique. This means asking for a large commitment and being refused, and then asking for a smaller commitment. That's why it's called the door in the face. It starts out with getting your a door shut in your face, because obviously the large commitment seems very high and it gets rejected. But then when a counteroffer is given that's really low in comparison, then it feels like a steal, because relative to the first offer, it's such a big difference. However, if they had started off with that in the beginning, it may not have garnered as much interest, and it may not have demonstrated or may not have given you the impression that it was a real value or a bargain. Whereas starting out with a high amount and then going low makes the potential buyer feel like they're actually getting a deal. And so this is door in the face technique. And this is also, this may be used in other sales as well. Whenever you see somebody who starts off low and then drops the price, this is the door in the face technique. Another principle is the principle of reciprocity. Anytime somebody does something for another person, that person may feel obligated to do something for the other in return. And that's because of the norm of reciprocity. For example, if a waiter leaves chocolate mints for restaurant patrons, the restaurant patrons may feel obligated to reciprocate by giving a higher tip. And that's actually been demonstrated in research. Anytime somebody is going out of their way to make the other person feel like they're doing something special for them or doing them a favor, then the other person may feel obligated to reciprocate by actually buying or moving forward somehow. And so that's reciprocity. The other technique is a lowball technique. And this is getting a commitment from a person and then raising the cost of that commitment over time. And so it starts out cheap, but then over time, the price goes up. So this is used in, like with renting, they're given an option to rent something for really low, but then over time, the rent is raised each month or over a period of time to the point that it's higher than they might have imagined going into it. And so that's a lowball technique. Compliance, or the changing of one's behavior at the command of an authority figure, is called obedience. Obedience is compliance due to authority. And authority is basically someone in a social role with power. They're in a position of power. Stanley Milgram wanted to understand the justifications for acts of genocide that was offered by those accused at the World War II Nuremberg war criminal trials. So they wanted to understand the justifications for why did the Nazis engage in genocide? So an experiment was conducted focusing on the conflict between obedience to authority and personal conscience. They wanted to find out, would people actually obey authority or would they follow their conscience? So participants or teachers were instructed to give electric shocks to another person, the learner, who only pretended to be shocked. However, the participants did not know that these people were pretending. So the question would be, whether they would actually electrocute these people, not knowing that it was all pretend. So here's a sample script from the experiment. At the low end, when the supposed teacher had received an error from the learner, they would start off by giving a smaller voltage or shock with 120 volts, and the acting learner would yell, "Ouch! Experimenter, let me out of here. I'm through. Please, I have heart trouble. I don't want to go on." But then, when the participant asked if they should continue, the authority figure would tell them to continue on. So they would, and they would go on to the next higher voltage. And then the learner would say, "That's it, enough. I will not be part of the experiment. Let me out now." And they would keep going until they were screaming. And then at some point, they would no longer respond. And then the participants would panic and wonder what's going on. And of course, they would feel like the authority figure is telling them to do it, and they're just following the authority. So Milgram found that 65% of people obeyed the orders of an authority figure, even if someone was potentially harmed. And there have been, of course, endless debates about problems with the study. Let's take a look at them. First of all, some critics pointed out the study subjected participants to extreme emotional distress. Afterward, they felt really bad that somebody potentially could have been killed. Now, others would say, well, that's them. That, if they were going to kill somebody, it'll be a wake-up call. And it's true that many people who did participate in the research study did feel like their eyes were open and they discovered how much they were influenced by authority figures. So many people actually said it was an eye-opening experience. However, there was a small number of people who were very distressed as a result of the study. And it raises the question about informed consent. So since then, experiments that involve human subjects must go through a more thorough ethical review. But other criticisms are more pertaining to the actual content of the findings. So some argued that a psychological explanation cannot justify the genocide. The Nazis still made choices for which they are responsible for and they must be accountable for. Also, the Nazis were also motivated by racism and hatred and knew that they were murdering their victims. So it's not simply just about following authority. Many actually were motivated by racism and hate, and they knew consciously what they were doing. They knew that they were killing people. That brings us to the subject of abuse of power and control. Now, there's a Duluth model that explains why or how people in relationships engage in abuse of power and control of other people. And so some of the methods that people use to abuse and control people are things like intimidation, emotional abuse, economic abuse, that means withholding money or exploiting people financially. Then there's isolation, keeping people from their friends or their support network. Then there's minimizing, denying, or blaming others. And this is basically like gaslighting or making people think less about their concerns. Then there's using children and pets as pawns. So people, if they want to have access to their children or their pets, then they have to comply. Then there's the use of privilege, most commonly male privilege. So men who abuse their positions of power as a head of the family or using their social resources as men are basically abusing their privilege. And lastly, there's the use of coercion and threats. And sometimes people actually just put fear in others as a way to control them. And so all of these are methods of abusing power and controlling people. Now, some of these behaviors can also show up in groups, and that's why it's important to look at group behavior as well. So let's talk about that. First, there's groupthink. Groupthink occurs when people feel it is more important to maintain group unanimity and cohesiveness than to consider the facts of a problem more realistically and make critical decisions. For example, you might think of some major disasters like airplane crashes or the Titanic going down. All these were probably due to groupthink. People didn't feel like they had the ability to stand out and say something different. And again, there's also the diffusion of responsibility as well. So people feel less personally responsible if the rest of the group is going along with something. So how do you minimize groupthink? It's important to maintain an impartial leader. They shouldn't have an agenda. Otherwise, they're going to persuade the group to go along with their opinion. It's also important to seek outside opinions. Sometimes when you're only listening to the people in your group, it starts becoming an echo chamber where everybody's saying the same thing, but they're not really being critically challenged by people who might be coming from a different perspective. For example, I know that in many churches today, they don't know how to reach out to people beyond their church boundaries. So they end up doing things that are really weird or suspect by society because they're only listening to people in their church. I can think of many evangelistic methods that don't really work because they haven't been really vetted outside their own church. So these are suffering from groupthink. Now, another method is to state problems in an objective manner. So this is eliciting an objective response. If you lead out a group and you're asking them to decide on something, but you're asking it in a leading way, then you're basically priming people to give you the answer that you're looking for. For example, if you're asking a church whether or not they should ordain women or not, and then you start off by saying, well, of course we all know that this is rebellion, but then what do you guys think? Then of course nobody's going to disagree, because they're not going to feel like they have the freedom to. And so it's important to ask questions in an objective way. Otherwise, you're going to bias the group's opinion. It's also important to subdivide large groups into subgroups. That's because in large groups, you might have a few voices that are going to dominate, but then you may have less diversity of feedback. Whereas if you broke people into smaller groups, they're less susceptible to groupthink at a large level. And so they might have groupthink within the small groups, but at least they're a lot smaller. So you're more likely to get some differences of opinions and diversities of ideas because you have multiple groups going on. Another thing you can try doing is encourage questions and alternate solutions. Just making a safe space for people to come up with divergent questions and solutions. That's also going to help. Otherwise, if people are discouraged from asking questions, then they're just going to go along with the groupthink. Another strategy is to use secret ballots. If you use an open voting system, people may feel pressured to conform to people around them, or they may feel like their vote is going to be held accountable by their constituents or by their colleagues as well. Or they may feel less likely that they can disagree with the leader without retribution. So secret ballots allow people to be anonymous and to be open without worrying about what other people think. And lastly, people need to be held responsible for the decisions made by the group. So if you say you're going to be responsible for this, then people may, otherwise, if they feel there's a diffusion of responsibility, then they may feel, it doesn't really matter what the group thinks, I'm not responsible. However, if group members know that they're going to be ultimately responsible for what the group decides, then they may need to think twice before they go along with it. Another issue that happens is group polarization. This sometimes is an unintended outcome of group discussions when discussions lead people to take extreme positions in decision making. This is a little different from groupthink. Groupthink is unipolar in the sense that everybody's moving toward one direction, whereas group polarization is when the group is split between extreme positions. It's kind of like groupthink in the sense that people are still going along with others, but it just happens to be more divergent and people splitting into two or several groups. And this can be seen in our society in terms of politics, especially when people become more and more entrenched in their positions and they're less likely to listen to people of different persuasions. Other forms of group behavior are the result of the presence of others. So the presence of others can influence how well an individual performs a specific task. So all these three things here are about how effective people work when they're in their social context. So first there's social facilitation, then there's social impairment, and then there's social loafing. What are those? Social facilitation is a tendency for the presence of other people to have a positive impact on the performance of an easy task. The opposite of that is social impairment. And this is when an individual's performance is inhibited by the presence of others. So, for example, if other people are slacking, then you're more likely to slack off too because everybody else is doing it. Or actually, that would be social loafing. But social impairment is when other people are distracting you, for example. Social loafing is a tendency for people to put less effort into simple tasks when working with others in a group as opposed to working alone. In other words, the group causes individual contributions to decrease. In other words, people are less likely to pull their weight. I remember when my wife and I were just dating, we were just becoming friends, we were in work groups for our classes. You know how teachers oftentimes subdivide students into groups for the purpose of a class project. And so we would be in a class group project or a project group, and everybody else seemed to be loafing, but we wanted to have A's. So we wanted to do well. So we banded together to work hard to get an A, even when the others were engaged in social loafing or they were slacking off and not pulling their weight. And that can happen in group projects, which is why some people don't like them. Okay, so groups and cults also can affect us when we identify with them very strongly. Sometimes we put our social identity in a group or a cult. We're going to talk about cults as a form of groups. So groups can oftentimes provide people a sense of social identity. Maybe you can think about some groups that you belong to that give you a sense of identity. That could be a religion that you belong to, a school you go to, or a clique that you belong to. Each of these will give people a sense of identity. Being in a group can also cause de-individuation or the loss of a personal identity. Kind of like the diffusion of responsibility, how people don't take personal responsibility for something because they're in a group of people and they think other people can do something. In the same way, when you're part of a group and you strongly identify with a group, you can lose your sense of personal identity. You become more caught up in conforming to the group, and it's more about the group's identity. And this is called de-individuation. An example of this might be soldiers who join the military. Part of the training is to get people to think like a soldier. And that basically means their loss of personal needs and desires so that they can support the group and be good soldiers, be cohesive and conforming to the rest of the group to be more effective. Otherwise, if everybody's pulling in different directions, doing their different things, that can be really distracting for a group that needs to have high levels of order and discipline in order to be effective. So that's de-individuation. Identity fusion is a form of extreme alignment with groups in which members experience a visceral sense of oneness with a group to the point that they would die for that group. And people looked into identity fusion in relationship to terrorist groups after 9/11. For example, one researcher wanted to find out, why did people join Al-Qaeda and become suicide, like the suicide bombers or, terrorists who would kill themselves while killing other people? Why would they die for that kind of purpose? And what they found was that people became so aligned with the group that they didn't care about their own lives anymore. And that's called identity fusion. Now, that brings us to the subject of cult and the features of cults. Cults provide members of their group a sense of identity, meaning or purpose, security, and worth. Members depend on the group for their identity. And depend is the key word here, meaning that they become codependent or really, really dependent financially or emotionally on the group. They may even be exploited because of that. But they start to have an us versus them mentality. They see others outside the group as the enemy, and they see themselves as superior. So when they meet people who are not part of the group, they immediately write them off or see them as others. And oftentimes they only associate with or have friends with people in the group or in the cult. That's because they consider the members of that group superior. And to associate with people outside the cult would be counterproductive to their purpose. There's actually many different types of cults. You might think of religious cults first because those are the most common kind that we think of. And there's different kinds of religious cults. There's satanic cults like the occult. There's New Age cults. And there's also Christian cults, conservative Christian cults. You can have them on all ends of the spectrum. There's also gangs, street gangs. And they also act like a cult in the sense that they give young people a purpose. They might have some different principles, but they still provide people a sense of identity and purpose and even provide some security sometimes. Now, there's also business cults. Business cults are interesting because people think of cults as religious usually, but businesses can also be turned into cults. Think of, for example, multi-level marketing or MLM groups. Anytime you're asked to recruit other people to be successful in your business, that would be multi-level marketing. And that's basically like a cult because it's self-perpetuating. And then people become so caught up in their product that they are no longer objective about it. And then there are therapeutic or self-help cults. And these involve pseudotherapy, or there are some yoga gurus that have their own cults. There are some NLP, neuro-linguistic programming groups. And there are even large group awareness trainings. And these are leadership workshops that are offered and that people can go to on the weekends. And they sound like they're very business savvy because they're focused on leadership. And yet they can still be a cult because in order to graduate, many times they're told that they had to go out and recruit other people to graduate. And in order to recruit, they have to tell people about the positives of this group. Now, it's a cult because you shouldn't have to depend on that. If your group or training is very successful, then you shouldn't have to rely on people, encouraging people to say good things in order to get business. It should be able to stand on its own because your product or your program is high quality enough that people will naturally want to share it with others, not because they have to. There are also doomsday cults. Doomsday cults are those who predict apocalyptic end, like Heaven's Gate, for example. And oftentimes these have had tragic consequences, especially when those predicted events do not happen. Like with the Heaven's Gate cult, they thought that the world was going to end and they all killed themselves. There are also political cults. And think of Jim Jones. The so-called Reverend Jim Jones was actually a political leader, and he was actually a liberal who believed in racial equality, and he believed in, I think it was socialism or a communist ideal, and was fighting against capitalism and believed that the United States was becoming increasingly corrupt. And they also believed in equality and egalitarianism and sharing things. And he became very popular, very popular. He had large groups of people all over California, and they would come together and meet in churches. And even though he was Christian, or he supposedly identified as Christian and called himself Reverend Jim Jones, he was a self-appointed leader, and he seemed more interested in politics than Christianity, much like a lot of Christians today, unfortunately. But this would be actually more of a political cult because they were more focused on capitalism, and they were promoting socialism or communism instead. Then there's also personality cults. And these are very common today, and especially in my church when you have celebrities, preachers, and things like that. You can see in a lot of mega churches, you have personality cults that are basically like big gatherings that are gathered around a celebrity or famous preacher or something like that. And these are personality cults. And we see them a lot. I see them in my own church. Big name preachers, and oftentimes their status goes to their head. And we've had one person who I know of who was a very famous leader in GYC, and he ended up abusing children, young minors, or college students, or high school students. I can't remember, but how old they were, but they were teenagers essentially, and he was abusing them, taking advantage of them, and it was probably because he, became full of himself and started thinking he could get away with it. That would be a personality cult. Not all personalities or celebrities are going to be that bad, but many oftentimes do become bad because the power corrupts. You might also think about famous singers who've taken advantage of people. Our president, Donald Trump, once said he thought he could get away with grabbing women in inappropriate areas because he was famous, and he said that when he was a TV personality. And so, that's a personality cult. There are also polygamous cults, and this is when people engage in marrying more than one partner. This was an example. This would be the early Latter-day Saints, the Church of Latter-day Saints. And now since then, early on, they denounced polygamy and even banned or excommunicated members who engaged in polygamy. But because there were early members of the Latter-day Saints or Mormons who were practicing polygamy, they broke off and started their own offshoots. And so these were polygamous cults. And then there are also racist cults like the KKK and the Nazis. And then lastly, terrorist cults like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So here's a picture of KKK group, Ku Klux Klan. And this is an example of a racist cult. This is an example of Jonestown Massacre. So this is Jim Jones on the right. This was a political cult, like I said. And apparently, when there was investigations going on about Jim Jones and the potential for abuse and exploitation of members, they decided to leave California and they migrated to Guyana en masse. And so a lot of people flew over there and resettled. Now, a congressional delegation traveled down to Jonestown to look at what was going on. The delegation that went to see them wasn't entirely concerned, so they were about to leave, except that Jim Jones was freaking out and concerned that they were going to be reported and have a government invasion. And so Jones sent a paramilitary group to chase after the congressional delegation, and they assassinated Congressman Leo Ryan as well as several other people. As a way to prevent the people from being taken over, Jim Jones encouraged a mass suicide and massacred the remaining people. So overall, 900 men, women, and children were killed. And this is an aerial photo of their little village of Jonestown. This image was taken by the FBI in 1978. And before the bodies were removed, you could see over the landscape dotted 1,000 bodies, essentially. And it's really sad and tragic. There was actually audio of Jim Jones talking and telling people how to die, basically. An example of a religious cult would be the Branch Davidians, led by David Koresh. The Branch Davidians were an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Basically, early on, there was a group that splintered off from the Seventh-day Adventist Church called the Shepherd's Rod. And then out of Shepherd's Rod splintered off the Branch Davidians. And these people were followers of Victor Houteff, I believe his name was. And he called himself David Koresh because he was basically a messianic figure. He believed himself to be Messiah. And all these people followed him because of that. He spouted scripture and told people how to live their lives. And then he preached about a coming apocalyptic showdown with the government. So they stockpiled weapons in the compound in Waco, Texas. Now, the government wanted to investigate the stockpiling of weapons, but honestly, it was pretty stupid. If you know if a group is expecting an apocalyptic showdown, then don't show up looking like an apocalyptic showdown. And so they were kind of asking for it. It was not very wisely conducted, to be honest. So they showed up with the ATF, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Division, as well as the FBI. And they were investigating this stockpiling of weapons. But unfortunately, it led to a shootout. So because it was a compound, all these cult members trapped themselves, locked themselves, or fortified themselves in the compound so that the FBI and the ATF were on the outside. So they camped out on the outside of this compound for a month, hoping that the people would come out. They tried blaring music and they tried calling and negotiating to no avail because these people were expecting a showdown with the government. I should also add that there was concern about ongoing child abuse, which is why they decided to go ahead with the raid anyway. So eventually, the law enforcement officers and the FBI tried to get them to come out through force. So they shot canisters of tear gas to try and get the people to come out. But unfortunately, the tear gas was explosive and flammable, and they actually caused an explosive fire. There might have been cult members who were being shot by their own leader. And so either way, just about everybody died in this compound, either from fire or from getting shot at. And so this was a major tragedy that took place in the 1990s. A lot of people still talk about it. And it's an example of a religious cult that believed in apocalyptic showdown. And one of the classic symptoms of this is that they had a narcissistic messianic figure who told people how to live their lives. So what are some common features of cults? Some common features are that they feign love or care for your well-being until you want to leave. For example, in the Jonestown Massacre, some people wanted to leave and they wanted to get out of there, but they would probably end up getting killed first. So if they were able to survive the massacre, they had to leave the night before under the cover of darkness. There's only 10 people, I believe, who made it out alive. Otherwise, everybody was poisoned by cyanide, and they were made to drink that. And that's why you might hear the phrase, they drank the Kool-Aid, or you've been drinking too much Kool-Aid. And that is a saying that represents people's commitment to a cult. Basically, they're brainwashed, essentially, by being in this cult. But if people try to leave, they get killed. But even if you don't get killed, many cults make it really hard for people to leave because otherwise they are it feels like a backstab to the group, or they feel like a betrayal or a loss of loyalty. For example, I've been to many small churches where they're really great. They really show they're really nice to you. They're very friendly, and they go out of their way to accept you into the group until you decide to go somewhere else. And then when you go somewhere else, they stop calling you like they never cared about you. And so this is an example. It's a typical cult feature of a cult. So they care about your well-being until you leave. Another feature is that they foster dependency on the group or the charismatic leader or authority who's always right. And this dependency can be fostered in different ways. It can be through giving you a sense that you're loved, or love bombing, or a sense of community, and which will make it really hard to leave because then you feel like you're hurting these people who've loved you and cared about you. Or they might foster dependency through a sense of being the moral arbiters of life. And for some reason, cult members will never feel like they're good enough, and they're always walking on eggshells trying to figure out how to be good enough. And so they depend on the group to tell them how to be good. Like I'm just thinking about somebody who I knew who was very abusive, and his partner didn't know anything about Christianity, but she was very much interested in it. But he was always telling her what was right and wrong, and she became dependent on him to tell her what was right or wrong. And that is one way of creating dependency, when you have to depend on the group to tell you what is morally correct. Sometimes, though, people are also exploited and dependent on the group for money, financially, or for sex or drugs. And this could be in the case of like street gangs and prostitution or things like that. And so these would be other features of a cult, but they all come down to basic dependency or codependency on the group. Another feature is the presence of a charismatic or narcissistic leader who has very little accountability. They lack accountability morally, financially, or legally. Morally, in terms of that they are accountable only to themselves. They might not have an independent board. They might run the board. They may not have to answer to anybody. And financially, they may not allow their books to be audited. And so nobody can see where their money is being spent. So there's no accountability in that regard. Or they may not feel like they should be held accountable to the legal system. I have to say that many churches feel like they don't need to be accountable to anybody. And so I'll talk more about that in a second. But dependency ultimately allows people in the group to be exploited, whether it's financially or sexually even. They may even normalize sexually abusive behavior. But not all cults are necessarily sexually abusive, but they oftentimes lead to exploitation. They may lead to financial exploitation. Like they may take your money to the point where you depend on the group to survive financially. Or they may blackmail you even. They might exploit you sexually, because you're in a vulnerable position and you depend on the group. And there's an intolerance of critical questions that foster groupthink. It reminds me of the Jonestown massacre. Right before the final suicide, some people were asking questions about whether the children should be spared. And the group shouted them down, telling them, suggesting that they weren't good members or they weren't loyal enough. And so there again was this groupthink. Cults also use shame or fear to prevent exiting. So if you exit, then somehow you're a failure or less than. Or they might threaten you. They might make you afraid to leave. In the case of gangs, for example. So leaving can be very difficult. Loyalty to the group is more important than loyalty to higher principles. And lastly, entrance into the group will involve coercive indoctrination or re-education. So maybe intensive re-education, so that by the time you're through with it, you're inculcated into that group, into that cult. Now, another example, just to give you an example, I can think of even large church denominations can sometimes have cult-like tendencies. For example, I think of many examples of sexual abuse in the Roman Catholic Church, like the Boston Archdiocese, or in Australia, there was cases where thousands of cases of child abuse went unreported to the police because it was kept secret. And so you see examples of cult features here. For example, they didn't feel that they should be held accountable to the legal system. They should be accountable to themselves. So they only handled it among themselves, and so therefore they oftentimes ended up shuffling their own predatory priest around because they didn't think they should have to report them to the civil authorities. They felt like they should be able to handle their own. Anytime you feel like you shouldn't be accountable to outside groups, there's a danger there. Whenever you think you should only be accountable to yourself, that's a problem. We all should be held accountable to some other people, especially objective people. And then also in the case of the child abuse the cases of child abuse in the Catholic Church, there is more loyalty to protecting the image of the church rather than protecting children from greater harm or more harm. And so that's another example where your commitment is more to a church rather than your principles. And anytime, this can happen in my church as well. We see these features of cults in just about everywhere, a lot of churches. Now, I'm going to talk about the difference between a healthy church and a cult in the future, but I just want to talk today more about the features of a cult. But anyway, the point here is that strong group identity can lead to a greater polarization. Group members adopt an us versus them mindset. So they think other people are outsiders, and they think of other people as less than, and they don't have to care about what other people think. But we also see this in political groups as well. Even with, like in my country, Democrats versus Republicans. People stop seeing other people as human beings. As soon as you hear that somebody is of a different political party, the label goes up, the wall goes up, and you stop listening to people. And then people start just parroting their own political talking points rather than really being objective and listening to what the other party has to say or what they have to offer. And that's the problem. I think, honestly, a lot of political parties are becoming more and more like cults today. So we're going to talk about moral leadership in the next segment, and I'm going to talk about power and ethical persuasion as an answer to what we've been talking about in this lesson. But thank you for listening.